As economies around the world recoil in the face of COVID-19, their carbon emissions are also shrinking. With businesses shutting up shop and global supply chains disrupted, pollution from transport and manufacturing have taken big hits. Just how much New Zealand's emissions will drop remains to be seen, but environmental scientists and the Climate Change Minister all agree that it's what happens when the economies kick back into gear that will matter the most. Nita Blake-Persen reports.
Airports are emptying out and factories are grinding to a halt. Entire communities are in quarantine and countries are shutting their borders. The effects of COVID-19 are being felt across the planet and in its environment.
In the short term, I think that carbon emissions are going to fall. You know, people are not moving around so much. Trade has dropped. International travel has dropped. Production has fallen. So I'm sure that there will be a temporary drop. The big question is, will the world go back to the way it was once the epidemic is past?
Alistair Woodward is a lead author for reports for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's one of a number of scientists keeping a close eye on how the disease outbreak is affecting emissions. Another is Victoria University Director of Environmental Studies, Professor Rafe Chapman.
The obvious thing that's happening is that emissions are falling, so it's most obvious in China, where, for example, there's been a big drop in airline travel, and so carbon emissions from that source are falling.
It's not just flights from China. With much of the country now in lockdown, figures from the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air show emissions have dropped by 25%. Climate Change Minister James Shaw says New Zealand will no doubt be affected too.
There is already a reduction in tourism, for example, and so obviously that leads to a temporary drop in emissions as well. You know, I need to say any effect is only going to be temporary, and so we need to sort of stay focused on permanent solutions.
While he says there aren't any forecasts around New Zealand's situation, the current shutdown is not the way we want to be curbing rising carbon emissions. It's
not a good thing to have a situation like we've got with COVID-19 and all of the impacts that go along with that. That is not the way that you want to reduce your emissions. What you want to do is reduce your emissions by decoupling economic development from growing emissions.
Professor Chapman says the very swift response to COVID-19 has been in stark contrast to how governments have responded to climate change.
Now, I don't want to be alarmist, but there's the potential for climate change to generate hundreds of millions of deaths. And that is, it's a different order of magnitude, much bigger scale than the impact of COVID. So, I mean, I'm not saying that the pandemic here is trivial. It's not, but a pandemic at the moment. But, climate change will start to have an enormous impact as we go forward. And, you know, the estimates already are that, you know, many tens of thousands of people are dying already from climate change. That's actually more than from COVID.
But Greenpeace's Amanda Larson says it shows that where there's a will, there's a way.
Climate change deniers love to perpetuate this myth that it's too hard or inconvenient to change the status quo. But what we're seeing is that both people and governments can adapt quickly in the time of crisis.
James Shaw says climate change and COVID-19 are both crises, but are very different in their nature and require different responses. As the government prepares economic packages to ease the impact of COVID-19 on New Zealanders, Mr Shaw says they'll be bearing carbon emissions in mind so that the current drop isn't just a temporary measure. For Checkpoint, Nita Blake-Persen.